Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our Center for Humanities Research Colloquium at Virginia Tech. I'm Sylvester Johnson. I direct the Center for Humanities, and I want to thank our team, Joe Fort, who leads the Athenaeum, which is the digital humanities hub at Virginia Tech. Dominique Francesca is our business manager at the Center for Humanities, and Trevor Sumraj, who's a grad assistant for the Center for Humanities, for helping us to put this together. I'm really excited that today we are speaking with Dr. Trevor Thomas Stewart. Dr. Stewart is an associate professor in the School of Education, and he's the program leader for English education at Virginia Tech. After serving in the Marines and working as a framing carpenter, Trevor got started in education as a high school English teacher in a small mountain community in North Carolina. Those early teaching experiences spurred his interest in finding ways to better serve students, teachers, and communities. So he went to the University of Georgia to pursue a PhD in language and literacy education and a certificate in interdisciplinary qualitative studies. Now, before coming to Virginia Tech in 2014, he worked at Appalachian State University, where he taught courses focused on writing, English language arts methods, and digital literacy. Trevor's scholarship is grounded in the work of Russian literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin, and his research interests include the influences of educational policy and high-stakes testing on English teachers' instructional practices, making creativity a central element of the learning process, and finding ways to support pre-service and novice teachers as they respond to the challenges that they encounter in the classroom. Professor Stewart has received the Outstanding Scholarship Creative Achievement Award from the Wright College of Education at Appalachian State University in 2014, and he received the Gary Moorman Early Career Literacy Scholar Award from the American Reading Forum in 2017. His most recent research projects explore the utility of protocols that are designed to create opportunities for teachers to share and workshop the challenges that they encounter in their classrooms. By sharing what he's learning with teachers and students, can bring classroom content into dialogue. By sharing and learning what he's actually gathering from these teachers, Trevor wants to generate ideas about how schools can become places where its teachers and students can bring classroom content into dialogue with life in order to increase opportunities for people to develop and pursue their own personal and professional goals. Central to this work is addressing an increasing lack of autonomy for teachers and the long-standing problem of isolation in the field of teaching. So welcome, Trevor. We're so delighted that you're here to speak with us about this.
Thanks, Sylvester. I'm really excited to get a chance to talk with you some more today and talk about the work that I'm doing and what I hope to accomplish with it.
Oh, great. Well, maybe you can start by telling us about your research and what for you has shaped the most important questions that you're trying to answer.
Okay. So I mean, it all goes back to those early teaching experiences. Let's say the biggest thing that shapes my work as a researcher has been the students that I've taught. So at the very beginning of my career, I was teaching in, a 1A, which is a designator for a very small high school, less than 500 students, sort of in an isolated region of the mountains in Western North Carolina. And I had an English degree, but not much pedagogical background. And I thought I knew this content well. And so teaching should be okay, right? Not a big deal. And what I quickly found out was that teachers don't really, if they're going to be effective, they don't just teach English or math or physics or whatever. They're teaching children, they're teaching kids. And so you can't just worry about the content. So the kids taught me that. The kids taught me that you've got to make it matter to them if you want them to take something from it. And so that led me to trying to figure out how to engage the kids in the content and make that connect with their lives while also dealing with the pressures that were increasing around standardized testing and the various school policies that were pulling my attention away from the kids in my classroom and towards these other things. And I got sort of frustrated with that. And so that led me to go to UGA to try to learn a little bit more about how do we engage kids and bring the content into dialogue with their lives. So I had read a book by this guy named Bob Vecchio, who was a professor at Georgia at the time, about his time teaching in a school in Philly, so an inner city context, but I saw a lot of the same issues in my rural classroom. And so I got to go learn from this guy. So I was frustrated by the things that were getting in my way of making the content matter to kids. And so that's just been what I've been after ever since I left my classroom in 2007, about how do we make classrooms places where everyone can see that the content matters to them and make that content serve their own purposes. So, it's the students I taught as a high school teacher and, the doctoral students and pre-service teachers I work with now just continue to make that mission a really important one for me.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating to hear about. There have been so many changing dynamics in the educational landscape over the years. And I'm wondering if you could tell us what you think are perhaps the two most important challenges that educators today have to contend with. Besides the pandemic, we're going to talk about that a little later.
Right.
But if we can bracket that more structurally with other things, what would you say are the two most important?
Yeah. So I think that there's two, one has, I think, emerged from this as an even bigger challenge from the start of my teaching career, which is the influence of high stakes testing and standardization in schools. And then the other is a longstanding problem of isolation in teaching. And I believe that, so if you've spent any time in a classroom as a teacher, that there are a million different things that appear very challenging, whether it's, figuring out the best way to teach a concept, or figuring out how to get kids off their cell phones, or, any number of these things that I would call the sort of in the moment challenges that make teaching hard. But I firmly believe, based on my teaching experience and my work as a researcher, that those two things really flow from these two larger tensions of a lack of autonomy on the part of teachers, and then this isolation that teachers are supposed to just figure it out for themselves, that they're supposed to enter the classroom as fully formed professionals who shouldn't say they don't know how to do something. And so I think all of the day-to-day challenges flow from those kind of two big tensions or categories.
Yeah, that's interesting. As you talk about that, I'm remembering some years ago when I was in first grade. I remember this talk about the California Achievement Test. So I grew up and went to school in Mississippi as a kid, and that was one of the first, I guess you can call it it was a form of a high stakes test, even though it didn't seem so high stakes at the time.
Not at all.
It was just starting out, and that was being incorporated. And at that time, it had not really affected the curriculum. It was just something that was introduced at a certain grade level you took. And then over the years, I think a lot of people will resonate with what you've identified as these two major challenges, because over the years, we've seen continuing growth in both the resources that are devoted to testing, the weight that is attached to them as consequences, and then the impact on the curriculum, and particularly how teachers are supposed to spend their time. So I'm thinking about the two things you've identified, the high stakes testing and then the isolation that teachers experience. And I'm wondering, particularly with that first one, what insight you might offer to what's often raised by people who are promoting the use of high stakes testing by saying that they most familiar argument to point to is that there has to be some systematic accountability for schools to demonstrate that they're actually delivering the learning that parents and students are expecting to receive from these schools. So Can you tell us how you would respond to that claim that is made in order to try to explain or to justify the use of these high stakes tests?
Sure. So I remember that California Achievement Test too. I went to Catholic school in Baltimore and we took those tests. And I remember them as a student. Now, there's all sorts of problems with like your memory as a student and what that means for what teachers ought to do. But I remember those tests, and they were almost like a free day. We just took this test, no big deal. And then um, I went into a ninth grade classroom, and I knew there was this end of course test, and it just shifted from being this thing that was done every once in a while, once a year, this test that a couple grade levels took to sort of judge progress, to these end of course tests that were driving everything that happened in the classroom. And it's a very much a situation where the testing and the accountability is driving the instruction instead of students' needs or interests, or even just the content itself driving the instruction. And two folks who want to have some system of accountability or checking in, are schools doing what they should do? Of course, right? I mean, we have to make sure that we're doing something to make sure that schools are equitable and that learning opportunities exist for everyone, and we have to have some way of measuring that. But when the use of that test gets twisted into a way that it actually, in my view, inhibits teaching and learning, it's highly problematic. And so my response to that is we need balance. We can't cling to what some folks in my field have called these tests as sort of rocks of stability. They're these things that make us, we can look at numbers and then we can say, yep, you're doing a good job, or no, you're not. When if you're just basing that on those numbers, you're not looking at the flaws in the tests and the way those tests privilege, some backgrounds, and really are unfair and invalid for folks from other backgrounds. But I think the biggest thing that we need to think about is, okay, sure, we need to know what a school is doing that's working, but our first duty is to the children, their families, and the communities. And we have to figure out how to not let the tests drive everything in problematic ways. And so one of the ways that I try to respond to this challenge with the teachers I prepare and the teachers I work with is, these tests they're not going anywhere right now. And these resources are being dumped into them, and people are making money off of them. So they're not going anywhere. And so we can either get frustrated by these standardized tests in the curriculum and throw our hands up and just teach to them and know that meaningful learning that goes beyond the test may not happen, or we can stop, pause, think about the things that are causing us to struggle and think, okay, how can I work within these constraints, versus saying I can't and just stopping. Mm-hmm. So I think it's incumbent upon teachers, administrators, policymakers, teacher educators, parents, anyone who cares about education to say, this is the landscape. There are constraints. How do we work within them to serve the kids who are in our classrooms right now? And then what action can we take at a local level first to start thinking about these things differently, and then use our voices, find ways to have our voices be amplified to speak out against the things that we think need to be changed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I think you rightly point to the ways that there can be significant transformation of the teaching given these systemic challenges that educational institutions are facing. So you also named isolation of the classroom as a factor of one of the big challenges that educators face. Do you think this is unique to the educational sphere, or there's something particular to it? Or is it just similar to the risk of isolation that might happen in any kind of profession?
Well, unfortunately, my work career is not, I don't have any kind of business background. I worked as a kayak instructor and a Marine and a framing carpenter and a teacher. And in those other professions outside of teaching, I never felt isolated. I never felt like I couldn't walk over to someone else I was working on a river with and ask for help about how to figure out how to teach someone how to surf a wave. Or, certainly when I was in the Marines, and this may be counterintuitive for some folks, but it was perfectly okay to go to someone and say, I need help with this. I mean, I was a scout sniper, and in scout sniper school, the instructors, were very, hey, if you need help, ask for help. We will teach you how to do this. If you're struggling with something, ask for help. So it was an ethos that was very much supportive, and it wasn't as siloed. And maybe it is because people were together. So, the carpenters on the job site, we were all working within eyesight of one another. And, it's working in these intimate, 2 to 6 man teams in the Marines. But in a classroom, it's the teacher and the kids, and that's all you can see in the classroom. And so maybe it's a structural thing where there's, you may eat lunch with the other teachers, but there's not the ready reaching out for help. But it's sort of a long-standing issue that teachers are isolated from one another. And then I think culturally there's a big fear of saying you don't know how to do something, you'll be seen as less than, fear of losing your job. But also I think there's some real hierarchical problems in the way schooling is done. And so the lack of autonomy and the isolation come together to create a very dangerous storm. And so just an example from a study I did, and this was in 2010, with the advent of high stakes testing, more and more teachers are given these pacing guides, and they're told to be on, a certain page of a certain book in a certain week. And so that erodes their autonomy. And I think that based on, the school where I taught is a little bit different. I feel like I could go to my principal and with new ideas all the time. And she was wonderful. She was always open to it. But very few of the teachers I've worked with have had relationships like that with principals. I'm not saying principals are bad people and not great at their jobs. I think that I was in a small school, it was easier. But if you've got 2,500 kids in your high school, the principal may not have time to be kicking ideas around with every teacher in the building. So I think it's a structural issue. But so anyway, I had this one teacher in a study years ago, and she wanted to change the text that they were going to use for this 9th grade class. It was they were supposed to read a Romeo and Juliet, a Shakespeare play, and the kids had already read Romeo and Juliet. They wanted to read something different. She deviated from the pacing guide, and she ended up losing her job at the end of the year because of it. A pretty extreme situation, but not uncommon. Wow. And I, in talking with her, she never went to the administration to ask. She just did it, because there is this ethos in teaching of just shutting your door and doing what you want, and this fear of asking for permission. And so I think there we see the standardization, the lack of autonomy coming together with this problem of isolation and making life much harder than it needed to be for that teacher. I think if she had been enculturated to go, to another teacher and then go to the principal together, I think the whole problem could have been avoided. And the way she ended up getting in trouble for that was someone in the local paper wrote a story about how she had brought this local Shakespeare company from a large city, which I won't name, and they had done this wonderful production of this alternative text, and then the head of curriculum in the school division found out that she taught a different text, and it just turned into this firestorm. It's mind-boggling, right? I mean, kids were engaged, people were learning, they did awesome stuff, but she deviated, and she did it in an isolated way, which was problematic. So, it's just one tiny example of how isolation can be a problem. But
wow.
I think it's a long-standing thing in teaching.
That's also just, you say mind-boggling. Yeah, that's a very compelling and terrifying anecdote. This just shows the larger point that you're making about what you mean when you say that teachers have lost autonomy. They've lost the ability to make decisions in the classroom that, to me, seem, now I would hope maybe to most people that would seem not just minor, but also a kind of decision that as an educator, you need to be able to make.
Yeah.
In order to do your job, that you can change the pace of things when you recognize that some students need to engage with this for longer periods of time because you're not teaching just one student. You have many students, and
Yeah.
people learn on different paces, or that you realize if you bring in a different learning experience, that it can enhance the intellectual well-being of those students without having to get special permission to decide how are you going to teach the students in your class when you're a professional.
Yeah.
Not like they're just grabbing people off the street and say, hey, can you teach this class? These are people who've devoted themselves to getting the skills and learning the content so that they can deliver learning.
Yeah.
So that's a very telling account about just what these challenges are.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting. Like, so for example, in Virginia, to get your license, you have to have taken not just a certain slate of classes, but one of them is you have to take a Shakespeare class, right? So the expectation is that you have some expertise in Shakespeare, and you ought to be able to swap out a text
Mm-hmm.
if it makes sense to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think to be fair to whoever was sitting in that curriculum office, they had poured time into creating a document. And even if I think it's problematic that we have documents like that, right? We have to work within our landscape.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that I'm really hoping to accomplish in my work as a teacher educator and someone who's trying to support novice teachers is how do we handle situations like that are productive? And so instead of just shutting our door, instead of giving up and just, doing this thing that you don't want to do, and then the kids can sense it, how do we notice this thing that's troubling us and then find a way to respond to it? And, so how might that teacher handle things in the future, right? Where she might be able to say, okay, I want my kids to be engaged. I've found a solution to the engagement at the moment. And so I'd like to figure out how to navigate that going forward. So how can I build some consensus amongst my teaching team? How can I share my ideas with others? How can I not work in isolation to take back some autonomy? I think that that's something that we need to teach folks how to do if we want them to do that. So if I see that as a potential avenue to improving what's happening in schools every day, then as someone who's responsible for preparing teachers, it's incumbent upon me to figure out how to let them practice things like that and try it out so that then they're prepared to do it. So they're not just sitting in their classroom frustrated by a pacing guide and faced with this either or decision of following it or not, right? So how might I take option C and think about how I can garner some support to make some changes?
Right. No, that makes sense. Well, those are some of the challenges. I'm wondering how you're thinking about the most exciting and inspiring opportunities to intervene in contemporary education.
Yeah. Well, I what I'm most excited about is when you look at schools, I think you have just this amazing opportunity for kids who are kids are fun. I mean, if you're a teacher, kids are fun. They're goofy, right? Even when they're getting over and goofing off and not doing what they're supposed to do, they're kids. That's what they are supposed to do, right? So if you can harness that energy, it can be a lot of fun. And sure, it can be frustrating, but that's what makes it fun every day because it's something different. And then you have teachers, and I've never met another group of people that are willing to work as hard as teachers are. I mean, and I think this may be one of the things that has worked against teachers being seen as professionals who ought to have more autonomy and more respect. And so, for example, my first year as a teacher, I was asked to coach the soccer team and the shooting team. So I lived in a small enough place that we had a shooting team, right? So I was asked to coach two sports as a first year teacher, which is typically not something you're supposed to ask a new teacher to do. But of course I said yes, right? And so then I was in my classroom until late every night because I'm an English teacher and I'm having to grade papers after practice. And one of my more experienced math teacher friends finally came to me at the end of the year and said, Trevor, you're going to quit teaching at the end of this year if you don't take better care of yourself and go home and Go do things you like to do. And so what I've seen across the years is teachers are folks who they just figure out how to do it. They'll get paid for an 8-hour day and work 15 regularly. And, we'll get to the pandemic in a minute, but, teachers are being asked to do things that they don't know how to do, and they're figuring out how to do it. And they don't typically complain too much. And I've done a couple studies on teachers voicing, their dissent online. And in general, they even if they're unhappy, they still just do it because they love the kids, and they want to serve the kids, and they want to serve the communities. And so I think it may work against teachers getting paid better and getting more respect, but I think it's, for me, a very exciting thing that you have exciting, creative, energetic kids in a classroom if you can direct that energy in positive ways. And I have a group of folks and teachers that I can work with who are willing to do most anything to serve the students in their communities. And so with that combination, there's you can really accomplish a lot. And so the one of the studies that I've been doing for the last 2 years, we at 4 different research sites followed groups of first, second, third year teachers for a couple years and met with them monthly. They read books. We talked about what was going on in their classrooms. These are people who are at the beginning of their careers and are willing to devote time to trying to get better, even though they just graduated from their program. So teachers are willing to put in all kinds of work. And that's just so exciting, because if you want to solve problems, you've got to do the work, right? If you want to respond to problems, you have to do the work. And so you have a group of people and teachers that are willing to do that. So I count myself very lucky to have found a profession where I have access to people who are excited about making changes and doing things better.
Well, you've written about dialogism and Wobble in explaining some of the possible ways that more positive outcomes can be advanced in education. Can you tell us what these strategies are and why they're important?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just quickly, the idea of dialogism for me, like you mentioned earlier, it flows from Mikhail Bakhtin's literary theory. And it's really about the way language and culture mutually shape one another. So, if you live in Mississippi, right, near the Mississippi River, and you hear the word river, you think of this big, wide, flowing river, and that shapes your view of what the word river means. But where I taught high school, the main river there is the Nantahala, and it's in places 12 feet wide across, and there are 8-foot waterfalls on it. It looks very different, right? And so that's sort of Bakhtin's theory of language in action. So our lived experiences shape even the words that we use and what they mean to us. And so I along with people like Bob Fecchio, my dissertation advisor, and Eugene Matusoff, and lots of other folks that are interested in this sort of stuff, we try to think about this idea of taking those lived experiences, taking people's language, and making that kind of a centerpiece in what happens in the classroom. And so it's the students and their lives that really is the driver for figuring out how to make the content matter. And so that's the idea of dialogic pedagogy, and that I work with the students, the pre-service teachers I work with. So how can we take these curriculum guides, these sort of standardized things that are happening in classrooms, and how can we connect them with what a student cares about? So instead of just saying, oh, well, we're going to make some tangential connection to your life when we're reading X book, it's what do the ideas in this book mean to you in your life? And that's the center of everything. So that's sort of the dialogism piece. And then this idea of Wobble that I've been writing a lot about lately, it comes from Fecchio's work. And so just to sort of explain it, I think as easily as you can, if you've ever been riding down the road on a bicycle and you've got a little bend in your front rim, the handlebars sort of shake a little bit. And if it's only a slight bend, you really have to be paying attention to notice it's there. Of course, if you've gone off a big jump and landed on that front wheel, you're going to have a dent in your rim. And as the wheel's rolling, it's going to be real easy to tell there's something wrong. And so in education, what I want teachers to do, and what I try to do myself in my own teaching, is pay attention to even those little vibrations and feel what's amiss. And then instead of just pedaling faster and trying to get through it and ignore it, or just going and buying a new wheel, thinking about how I can attend to that thing that has created that vibration. And even if it makes me uncomfortable, try to figure out how to respond to it in a way that will be positive for everyone involved. Because, those dents in the rims sometimes are where we can get the most growth. It's where we can enact change that's meaningful. And so if we continue to ignore problems, they get worse. And this is something I think, I'm seeing in the pandemic, which we'll get to in a few minutes.
Yeah, no, I would like to ask you about the pandemic now, because there's so much every day in the news about its impact on our learning institutions, certainly higher ed, but particularly K through 12. So many things hinge on the roles that K-12 school systems play in the lives of our society, as many of us have become more aware of. For example, being able to get food. The pandemic has created so many challenges, and one of the things that we've seen, particularly in this context, is the existing inequality has been getting manifested in ways that should not be a surprise, given how deep it is, but are certainly telling and really devastating. I'm reminding of one expert who was looking at some of these systemic issues that you've been studying and addressing in education, particularly with the terminology of failing schools. And so these is the rank that schools are assigned based on those results from high stakes tests, for example. And he was saying that we don't have failing schools, we have a failed society. And he was just pointing to the example in the Chicago public school system, over 20,000 homeless students. And you think about a kid who doesn't have a place to live, trying to learn when all kinds of things might be happening to them. And it's not, it's just one or two, it's thousands that are part of the school system. And the schools are trying to support the learning of all of these students. So I'm wondering what you might observe about the way the pandemic has really indicated to us what we should be learning, and what are some of the larger paths or correctives that need to be undertaken.
Yeah. So what you just said about the idea of failing schools versus a failing society, it's just it's so important. It's such an important thing. I think we have to, as a culture, reckon with this reality that we've been happy just to label those schools failing schools and then say that's the problem. The schools are failing, and the schools are failing based on tests and test scores, which I think by 2020 we know are pretty flawed in terms of cultural access and the questions that they ask. Mm-hmm. Even if you would argue that point, right? You're gonna say, well, the problem is the failing school based on this test scores, and ignore the reality of homelessness, ignore the reality of vast and highly problematic inequities in resources. And so I think in my view, the pandemic is a galactic wobble moment. So for years, I think in the U.S. we've been riding along, and if you're paying attention, you can see this vibration in the handlebars that we are not resourcing schools in a way that isn't remotely equitable. But if you're not feeling for it, if you don't want to see it, you could readily ignore it until about March of 2019. And then in March of 2019, I think it started getting a little bit more apparent to everybody that issues like connectivity, internet access, bandwidth, access to meals, even. The schools were doing much more than just teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic. Schools were a place for kids to get food. Right. So here in Montgomery County in Virginia, the one of the things that I was just most impressed by, school was called to be out because of the pandemic, I think on a Thursday or a Friday. And Monday morning, there were buses rolling into neighborhoods with meals on them. They were still sorting out how to get content home to kids, but I was just very impressed with the recognition within Montgomery County. And I don't want to hold it up as like this perfect. I'm certainly not a Pollyanna, right? Like, but I thought that was a very important way to signify that school was more about content. The meals were rolling home, but that's not something that's happened everywhere. And I think in all the places that it's happened, it's wonderful, and that's a start. But what we're seeing is some kids go to school, some kids are online fully, some districts are half and half, and teachers are tasked with figuring out how to build online content when they've never been taught how to build online content writ large. I mean, maybe some younger teachers have, and some older teachers who have facility with technology have been doing that well already. But the pandemic, I think, has exposed some real problems in the way we're resourcing schools. And I wish I could remember the name of it right now, but on BET's website, former student of mine, Tangie Reed Marshall, who's brilliant, wrote a really, really, I think, powerful and important piece about we have to get real with with the idea that we've been saying inequality is good enough and acceptable in this country for too long, and the pandemic is making it very clear to us that the inequities are huge, and we don't have, as you noted, failing schools necessarily. What we have is a failed society that is willing to not provide equal access and equity for everyone.
I want to remind our viewers that we'll be inviting your questions for Trevor in just a moment. So if there are questions or comments even you'd like to offer, please put those into the chat on the YouTube channel, and we'll be sure to pass those on to Trevor so he can respond to you. So I was wondering if you might identify one or two important outcomes that you would like to see happen in education at some point, hopefully in the near future, as a result of the kinds of work that you and your colleagues are doing to identify best practices in transforming learning, not just tweaking things, but also addressing some of the big challenges and opportunities. So what are one or two things that you'd like to see happen as a result of the work that you're doing?
Yeah. Well, so I think first and foremost, what I'd like to see is, schools of education preparing teachers to think in real meaningful ways about the value of the content that they're charged with teaching for the personal goals of their students. And so, I think that's building on what we already know in our field about the importance of relationships, and taking those relationships to a level where we really are connecting the content to the children's lives in a way that is more than just, oh, okay, you're interested in this kind of music, well, you can write this kind of music in your classroom. Like getting at that bigger picture ideas that create space in classrooms for dialogue about things that are uncomfortable, so that we might change and no longer be okay with the inequalities that are persistent. In terms of the recent work I've been doing, I've been studying these protocols for helping pre-service teachers and novice teachers identify the things that are creating challenges for them, and workshop them together to find a way to share with each other ranges of ways that they might move forward. So what's something that they might do that's actionable in their classroom, in the next couple of weeks, that would help them address that challenge instead of just saying that I can't. And so we've got a protocol here that I've been using at Virginia Tech I'm studying it this year again for the 6th year. That's basically, each person gets a chance to bring a problem to the table, and then we have a protocol in place that we use to discuss it and think about how to respond to it. And then another one that I did with Bob Petcho, Duan Coombs, and Todd Hawley, with where we followed those novice teachers over a span of time that works in a way that's very similar. So I would like to see more opportunities for teachers to share the things that they struggle with together, so they can find ways to claw back some autonomy, be comfortable speaking for themselves, but also see that they really have good ideas that they ought to share with one another, and that might create some changes. And then and this is sort of a new thing for me to be studying since March, but what are things that our teachers are doing in an effort to adapt to the pandemic that might improve their able to differentiate and engage students? So, one recent thing that I was talking about with my current group of pre-service teachers is an alteration of the writing workshop format, where you start creating a library of these digital mini lessons that you can house on your school's course management software, that would allow you to target different elements of writing instruction in different ways, and make that content available to students, and not just beamed home in some way, because of pandemic teaching, but when everyone does return to a classroom face-to-face, how might you split your classroom up and make that content available to the students, and then walk around the room and talk with them while they're viewing it, to group, and then you can group them in ways that isn't shameful because they're in the low group or the high group, because everyone's watching something individually. So just, I think there are lots of things that we're doing, that teachers are doing right now, that if we are thoughtful, systematic, and collaborative, we might adopt them to create some meaningful change in the local classroom level. And then it's up to folks to start speaking out and sharing those ideas, and start calling for systematic change.
Well, we have one question here, and again, I'll just remind others who are viewing to send us your comments and questions. We'll pass those on to Trevor so he can respond to them. One question is related to something you were just explaining to us, and that is, what is the role of distance learning or digital technologies in the education system? This is something, of course, as you were just describing to us, that has been used on an accelerated basis, not by choice, but by necessity because of the pandemic. And I think it's fair to say there's a mix of results and opinions about it all. But I'm wondering what insights you have to offer based on your research on the teaching strategies, the learning efficacy, given the different kinds of possibilities with the use of digital technology, whether it's a pre-recorded material that you just talked about, so that the learning doesn't have to be happening on a single pace that everyone has to follow, but you can allow for the individualized learning that can, in theory, at least produce more optimal outcomes. But what do you think about the overall usefulness of the digital technology, and what do you think are some of the caveats?
Yeah, well, I do think that the digital technologies are affording us with lots of ways to differentiate and connect across spaces, and certainly connect when we need to be distanced from one another for pandemic purposes or other reasons. I think it could be a way to increase equitable access to education. If everyone can't make it to a certain place to get some kind of learning, we do have the tools now, if we have the infrastructure in place for people to access things that we could produce digitally. So I think that's very important. And I started teaching online in 2010 in summer school. I pushed myself to try to figure out how to get a little better at teaching online, because I do think it's sort of a wave of the future in terms of the way universities are going to do business, and things we might find in terms of needs for students. Obviously, I didn't predict the pandemic or anything like that, but I wanted to figure out how to do it better myself, because I think that if you're just putting content out there and transmitting things, then there's no room for the mutual shaping for the students' interest to shape what's happening. And I think that's problematic. And so, but I have found that, you can, if you can get to know your students a little bit, you can tailor things for their needs and you can put stuff out there, and then you don't have to be in the same room with them and they can send things back to you. Mm-hmm. The big constraints though are if I'm a public school teacher and I have 25 to 35, 40 students in my classroom, building content that is relationship driven is quite difficult, especially if I'm not in the room with them. And so one of the big constraints that I'm seeing when I talk to my friends who are still secondary school teachers, when I talk to the students that we're putting out in schools, is you have a lot of students who, sure, they're logging on to the digital classroom and they're logging on so they get credit to be there, and they're walking away. Mm-hmm. And that, please don't misunderstand, I'm not saying that as any kind of complaint about the student. Mm-hmm. The point is, if that's what's happening, where's the opportunity for the teacher to convince that student that what's happening in the classroom matters, right? Mm-hmm. So my worry about a huge shift away from face-to-face instruction is when when I had 25 high school kids in my 9th grade classroom, and even when a large number of them didn't want to be there, we were all still there, and I could be Trevor, I could be Coach Stewart, I could be whoever I am, and I could have a personal relationship with them, even if it wasn't very effective at first. Over time, I could get to know them and give them a reason to pay attention, give them a reason to see that this content might matter in their lives. But if my only window into that student's life is transmitting content over the internet, I've lost my opportunity to actually build a relationship. Right. And I think teaching is a very relationship-driven business. So I think we have to find some balance and use the digital tools where they can be helpful, which is differentiating content, mm-hmm. Allowing students to create and do more than just write a paper, giving them new ways to show what they know. So I think there's lots of affordances from the digital technology, but we do have to be wary of the ways that they may erode our ability to connect interpersonally when we're doing large scale education, because that's what we're doing in the United States, is large scale public education.
Well, thank you. There is another question that someone has asked: are there any trends that you are seeing in education, either at the national or school level or local level, that show promise in returning autonomy to classrooms, to the teacher, or in promoting true collaboration among teachers? And this person's also saying, how can I, as a school administrator, support that process?
Mm-hmm. I do think so. I've seen, so I think one of the affordances of digital technologies is that it has led to more and more teachers going to forums, even like comment sections on Newsweek articles, and speaking out and speaking their minds about policies. And so I think that there are the tool of the internet is created a space for teachers to amplify their voices outside of their school buildings. Mm-hmm. And I think people are starting to listen a little bit. We saw a few years ago in West Virginia, teachers going on strike. And we saw some of that in Wisconsin a couple of years ago as well, in the Pacific Northwest. So I think there has been a little bit of a shift in teachers being willing to speak up more, and because we're in a teacher shortage yet again. And so when teachers speak up and threaten to walk out, people are listening a little bit. In terms of promoting collaborative learning communities among teachers, the work that I've been doing here at Virginia Tech, and then that study I did with the novice teachers here, it was at Kent State Teachers College, BYU. That's not unique. There's a school district in Wisconsin that the administrators have brought in folks to come and sort of replicate that work to create a professional development community of teachers. So I do think there are things happening where teachers are starting to band together a little bit and share ideas with one another. And I think we need to, if we can, as a as a group of leaders in the field of education, sort of promote these places where teachers are sharing their ideas, so other teachers know about them. I think that would be good. And I think the question about, as a school administrator, supporting the process, I think the biggest thing I would ask an administrator that I had a chance to sit down with to do was to build in professional development time into your academic calendar, where teachers can come together and work through challenges that they're having. So I know there's the need for continuing instruction in certain areas, like reading or writing across the curriculum, that kind of stuff, and so I recognize the pressure there to spend PD time on that, but going to the school board and advocating for the budget or whatever's needed to create space in the day somewhat regularly for teachers to voice their challenges, and then have a structure in place for them to figure out how to make changes. So not just have it be a complaint session, but so if you could build time into your school district's calendar for workshopping ideas that come from the teacher's individual classroom concerns, I think that would be helpful.
Very good. We have another viewer who has left a comment. Thank you for this incredibly inspiring talk. I truly appreciate your engagement with addressing inequalities and creating concrete change. So another question that is about the talent pipeline. So what are the challenges with the talent pipeline in education? And are there any changes that are happening in either the School of Education where you work, or more broadly in the field of education, that is trying to game change that talent pool, or trying to endow different approaches or new skills to address some of these larger opportunities and challenges?
Some of it's kind of I hate to use the term branding issue, but sort of a branding issue. I think that we as a culture need to find a way to make the teaching profession more attractive. And so I think what that means is we need to hear more stories from teachers that just show how personally rewarding teaching can be. And I don't mean stories, like the highly problematic teaching movie where the teacher comes in and saves all the students and then they all want to pass the test. I'm not talking about that kind of stuff. But chances for teachers to share their experiences. I mean, I've had so many where just teaching in Bryson City, North Carolina, these kids, they changed my life. I mean, I took the teaching job because I wanted to be inside for a winter after having bloody, cracked hands framing houses for a few winters, right? And I was like, I took the job for the steady paycheck and the heat in the classroom, and I stayed because the kids they showed me compassion and fun, and yeah, it was hard and it was frustrating and all of that, but it's such a rewarding profession. And I think people need to know that in teaching, you really do get more than you give. And so if we could also couple that with higher salaries, because I know that you also have to feed your family if you're a teacher. I think there's some structural issues that we could address. One of the things that I think inhibits the talent pipeline right now is when you graduate. Even so at Virginia Tech, we only have master's programs. Now we're trying to shift to recreate undergrad programs, and we push that through curriculum committee because it reduces the time it takes and the money it costs to get a teaching license. And then you could go back and, get a master's and become a master teacher. Lots of states have operated under that sort of model for years. But so when you get your teaching license and you start teaching, you're kind of topped out in terms of advancement in your career, unless you want to move into administration. And then you can kind of keep moving up a little bit. But sure, you could be a department head, but for folks that are goal driven, you sort of top out at being a teacher. And so then if you're not focused on intrinsically motivated growth, it's easy to get stale and steady, but it's also an inhibitor to someone who's goal driven to entering the profession, because they're going to top out, their first year teacher, they're already a teacher, right? But I do think we need to, so those are bigger structural changes. Locally here, I've been trying to figure out how to recruit different folks into teaching. So finding ways to, I created an online version of one of our foundations courses to try to make it available to people that aren't on campus. It's a course that if you're in a program like Troops to Teachers, making the transition from the military to being a teacher, it can serve your needs in terms of getting licensed. So I do think we need to find ways to look outside the typical talent pool, which is, in my experience, has been kids who grew up wanting to be a teacher, and find folks who like kids, want challenges, and are not your sort of person that always knew they wanted to be a teacher. So we need to find ways to attract them into our majors. And so I've been, I go to the English department and recruit, and try to talk to people who don't fit that normal. I lined my stuffed animals up and taught them when I was 5, kind of person into the teaching profession.
That's really useful to hear. We are close to the end of our time, and we have one more question. So I'm wondering if you could give maybe a 30-second answer or a 60-second answer. So the question is, looking at some of the urban areas and students in South Asia where internet is not easily available as many places here in the US, how can students with less access to internet and web-based resources get access to education equitably in this COVID and post-COVID era? So that's a big question, but if you could gesture towards something in about 60 seconds.
Yeah. So in 60 seconds, I think the first thing we need to do is try to figure out how to generate content and get it there that doesn't require the internet, whether it's shipping jump drives or things like that. But and then how can we work with folks in those areas who want to be teachers? Mm-hmm. So can we create some kind of funding source to create learning centers where we could teach some teachers to work in that areas where there are no resources? But I think the big answer there is a global and a U.S. answer as well, and that we have to recognize that the infrastructure is a problem, but that problem is not going to change until we're willing to give things up and spend money to fix that infrastructure. And when we blame the infrastructure, what we're doing is giving ourselves an excuse to be okay with inequity. And so I would ask everyone to look at themselves and say, how can I contribute and help others to change these things, by recognizing just myself and admitting that we have an equity problem, and then what can I do personally to change that in some way? It's going to take small steps by everybody, but the first one is recognizing that we've been okay with things that are inequitable for far too long.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Trevor Stewart, and his work on education, looking at some of these opportunities and methods for creating changes that can create a more equitable system that can enhance the learning that our students are getting. Thank you so much for spending time with us and this research colloquium for the Humanities Center and sharing your work with us. Thanks to our viewers for joining us as well. We hope you will look out for our announcements on our upcoming research colloquia talks. So thank you again.